In August of 1863, during a relentless storm, a young child wandered into the Old West town of Bannack, Montana, and brought with her a curse entangled in a ribbon, blood, and a black spot of death. Andrew Moore, a tradesman passing through the town, was braving the storm night when he came face to face with this girl. Not wanting to leave her out there at the mercy of the storm, he took her back with him, unaware that in doing so he was bringing a curse into his life. This is Andrew's harrowing account, retold from the journal entries left at the sheriff's station in the nearby town of Dillon. I never stayed in one town for long. It was usually just a few days, but if business was lucrative or a painted lady took my eye, then I would stay a day or two more. And if I stayed somewhere any longer than that, I would feel this sickness creeping over me. It's this itchiness on my skin that only subsided when I packed up my cart and I went on my way. Now, as a medicine man by trade, even I didn't know what affliction was causing such a plight. I just kept on going from one town to another with my trusty mare, Old Dolly, and as long as I didn't stay in one town for too long, well then the itchiness upon my skin wouldn't occur. Perhaps I was destined to wander, never finding peace in one place. I lived a simple life, and although I sometimes found myself yearning for more, a family and a home of my very own, my affliction disallowed me to wallow on such dreams. I had been in Bannack for 3 days, watching the endless parade of mud-caked prospectors stumble between the Hotel Mead and Skinner's Saloon. The town reeked of desperation and gold fever, but the desperation meant good business. These men would buy anything that promised relief. Ointments for their cracked hands, lotions for sun-scorched faces, tonics for mining-ravaged lungs. They didn't care if my medicines worked or not. In a town built on dreams of gold, hope was the only real currency. But something wasn't right in Bannack, something that left me feeling an uneasiness in my gut that I couldn't explain. Whispers of road agents and midnight hangings poisoned the air like coal smoke, but gold coins have a way of drowning out common sense. So I stayed the extra day counting my profits while something ancient and evil watched from the shadows. If I'd known what horrors that decision would unleash, I would have run until my legs gave out, until Bannack was nothing but a bad dream behind me. On the day that I finally packed to leave, Sheriff Plummer and his deputy, a small man with a well-weathered face whose name escapes my mind, were waiting for me at the hotel. Sheriff Plummer took great pleasure in accusing me of being a crook and a fraud. I protested my innocence, of course, but he was too fueled on power to listen. He confiscated my bag of vials, my cart, and even poor Dolly. And he told me that if I was who I said I was, well then I'd get them back when I had clarified my identity. I knew he was lying. I saw the satisfaction in his eyes at fabricating this story and making me sweat. I truly believe that he was only doing this because he took a dislike to me profiting in his town. I didn't like it, but I knew arguing with him would only lead to one place, rotting in a jail cell, so I had no choice but to go along with it, hopeful that he would soften over the coming days and wish me to be gone from his town. Luckily, the housekeeper of the hotel, a widow named Mrs. Burns, took pity on me, informing me in a hushed voice how the sheriff was just up to his usual tricks again, but he would soon tire. She told me that I could stay there for free, provided that I helped with some chores, and also gave her some ointments and lotions that she'd been eyeing up when they were returned to me. Well, I agreed, thankful for her kindness. The days passed by, and no amount of fixing up the porch steps and painting the shutters could distract me from my surroundings and my growing affliction, the red rash gnawing at my arm, caused by being stationary in this town for far too long. Sheriff Plummer was relentless in his hatred for me. I felt like a worm on his hook for him to dangle and taunt at will. And this itchiness was insufferable. I itched my arms until they were red raw, and despite the blistering heat, I tried my best to hide this beneath my button-up shirt and my jacket. I just needed to leave this town, but I needed my livelihood returned to me first. That evening, even though I smelt the sweetness in the air, a warning that a storm was brewing, I couldn't stay within the confines of the hotel, itching at my own skin anymore. Needing a distraction, I headed next door to drown my sorrows with whiskey at the saloon. I kept to myself, observing the card game taking place and eyeing up the painted ladies from a distance. And when I was ready to leave, the storm was gaining force, lashing heavy droplets against the wooden shutters, and one of the miners had drunk too much liquor and he was barely able to stand up. I offered to help his friend walk him home. It was a great inconvenience, seeing as that my hotel was next door, but he lived on the other side of town. We dropped him off, and then his friend went one way and me the other. By this stage, that storm was raging, and I was soaked through, my teeth chattering in distress. I was angry at myself for staying in this damn town too long and for being too kind for my own good. I was halfway back to town when I saw something in the road ahead of me. I didn't think much of it at the time. I continued walking, convinced that my eyes must be deceiving me. It was only as I grew closer that even through my rain-battered eyes, I realized that it was a young girl, about 7 or 8. Standing there in a long dress that stuck to her small frame, pink ribbons tied in her disheveled hair. I asked her what she was doing out in this storm and if she lived close, and she didn't utter a word. I don't know if this was because my words were slurred, or if she couldn't hear me over the raging storm. But knowing I couldn't leave her to the mercy of the elements, I placed my hand on her shoulder and I led her along the road. I remember an eerie quietness coming over me, as though the rain was falling in silence around us. Something was unsettling about this child and the situation, but I was too drunk at the time to think any more on it. I led her back to the hotel, certain that Mrs. Burns would agree with my decision to rescue a child from this storm. As the hour was late, no one was awake when I got back to the hotel. I rang the reception bell a couple of times, but no one stirred. I led the girl into the day room. I found a blanket for her and I told her I would get Mrs. Burns to take her to the sheriff's station in the morning and he would find her family for her. She didn't say a word as she perched on the edge of the chair, placed her hands on her lap, and just stared at me through pale blue eyes. I knew there was something untoward about this child, but as the storm roared outside, I knew my conscience would not allow me to send her back into it. I must have passed out from that whiskey as I woke on the day room floor in sodden clothes and I looked up to see my blurred reality take form. The girl remained perched on the edge of that chair, her hands resting in her lap and her eyes staring straight at me. I knew instantly that she had been like that all night. I rubbed my head, confused that I had no headache and that my skin wasn't red, raw, and itchy anymore. I looked at the calm skin on my arm with confusion, and then I looked back at the girl. Physically, I felt fine. I felt good, even. Yet the unsettling feeling of who this girl was stirred heavily in my mind. When Mrs. Burns flustered into the room, her arms full of bedding, on seeing the girl, her eyes filled with dread, and the bedding fell from her arms. It was as though she had seen a ghost. I walked over to her. I tried explaining how I found this girl in the storm, and she brushed me away with flailing hands, and then she stared at my palm, her mouth agape. I followed her gaze, and there, right on my palm, was a black spot no bigger than a coin. She stretched out a shaky arm and pointed at the spot as through clenched teeth she said, "How dare you bring the messenger of misery into this place? You foolish man, you have cursed us all." I pleaded that the girl was just a child and that I was hardly going to leave her out in the storm. But Mrs. Burns wouldn't listen. She screamed and she shrieked at me until I left. I told the child to come with me, but no matter how much I tried to pry her from that chair, she would not move, as though she was made of solid stone and set in place. I felt her blue eyes on me as I staggered out of the hotel. I'd only just made it outside when I heard the scream. A woman's scream. I ran back inside, calling Mrs. Burns' name, and I saw her there, above the desk, hanging from the ceiling by a leather buckle belt. I could hear her feet thudding against the desk, and thinking she was still alive, I ran over to her and I tried to pull her down. I saw the knocked over chair on the floor behind the desk, and I had to stand on it to reach her. I spun her around, her twisted face now coming into view, the horror of which caused me to fall backward onto the floor. Ribbon, smudged red, was stitched in a cross shape across her eyes and her mouth. Ribbon that, through the red, I made out the true color, pink like the ribbon in the girl's hair. As I crawled away from Mrs. Burns' maimed face and scurried across the floor, I heard this giggling, a child's. I stumbled back into the day room. The girl had gone, but the giggling continued to echo all around me. I looked at that black mark on my hand, and I wondered if what Mrs. Burns had said was true. Had I really let a messenger of misery into all of our lives? Despite my reservations, I couldn't bring myself to believe that a child could be a carrier of such misfortune. I headed toward the sheriff's station, where Dolly was tethered right outside. My cart and my medicine bag had gone, but I still had Dolly. I had a means of leaving this cursed town while I still could, and I knew I must go now before they blamed me for a murder that I did not commit and hung me for it. I jumped onto Dolly, careful not to touch her with my marked hand, and before I could tap my heels to get her moving, I felt this forceful hand pull on my leg and yank me from Dolly. The deputy, whose name I didn't know, was now stepping over me, his boot pinning my arm in place, and he shouted for the sheriff, telling him to come out as he'd caught a rat. I told him to let go of me. I warned him to not keep me trapped there, but he laughed, a gleeful, endless chuckle. I lifted my free arm. I looked at the black spot on it, and I pressed it to the bare skin on his ankle. At first, he only laughed harder at this, but then he saw the mark on my hand, and his eyes only told fear. He let go of me, and he gripped his throat as he fell to his knees. I heard him gasping for breath, his eyes pleading with me as he continued to strangle himself. Sheriff Plummer ran out, his handgun in hand, and he looked at his deputy in shocked terror. He ordered his deputy to stop, but he continued to strangle the life out of himself with his own grip. As the sheriff rushed forward to stop him, I buried my marked hand beneath my sleeve and I got on to Dolly. Shouting and gunshots followed me, but I galloped away from that cursed town, and on my way out of it, beneath the spitting sky, I saw a small figure up ahead, walking toward me on the road. I slowed down, but I knew better than to stop. My heart rumbled in my chest, frantic and forewarning. Walking toward me was the girl in the long dress, the hem now dragging in the dirt and with 2 pink ribbons tied into her entangled hair. She looked at me with pale blue eyes, but she didn't stop walking. I sped up and I cantered past her. I couldn't help but look back, but when I did, she had disappeared completely. She couldn't have fled to the trees that quickly, and the grass wasn't long enough to hide behind. She had simply just gone. In the next town, I used the few coins I had in my pockets to buy some gloves, and I vowed never to show my marked hand again. But desperation gnawed at me like a hungry wolf. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw Mrs. Burns' ribboned face. I heard the deputy's final gasps. The mark on my palm burned with memories of what it had done. Perhaps confession was the only way to break free from this cursed affliction. With trembling hands, I entered the sheriff's station, ready to unburden my soul before this darkness claimed another victim. In the nearby town of Dillon, a gaunt and confused Andrew Moore told Sheriff Ravenstone how he had unknowingly aided a messenger of misery. The sheriff thought that this was the ramblings of a man sick with a fever and decided to lock him in a cell for his own good while he fetched the doctor. In doing this, a scuffle broke out between the men. Andrew's glove fell from his hand and he touched the sheriff. About an hour later, on returning with the doctor who he relayed Andrew's story to, Sheriff Ravenstone seemed to lose all sense and stepped out in front of a horse and carriage and was trampled to death. Later on, in the mortuary, a young girl was seen by the undertaker walking away from the sheriff's body. Pink ribbon had been stitched in cross shapes across his eyes and mouth. Andrew Moore was released and left the same day on his horse. He was never accounted for again. The town of Bannack, although now abandoned, is still known for its ghostly, unsettling tales. Sheriff Plummer turned out to be a notorious bandit and was hung at the back of the saloon, where it is said now his restless soul still remains. Another of the town's haunted cases is of 16-year-old Dorothy Dunn, who drowned in a pond close to the creek. Many people have claimed to have seen her in the window of the Mead Hotel where she lived with her mother who worked there. It is unknown what darkness Andrew Moore unknowingly unleashed on the town of Bannack, or if the ghostly girl with the pink ribbons in her hair had been there long before him, feeding off the town's misery and corruption. For more scary horror stories, please subscribe.